Hello, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS, and I'm going to let you in on a private conversation with a very dear friend of mine who's just wrote a wonderful book, and with another very dear friend who has been my coach and mentor and friend for 40 years. But we're going to explore very interesting issues together, and I welcome all of you and delighted that you can join us. So thank you, and thank you, Sherri, for coming today and for a chance to talk about this. And Rudy, thank you. It's wonderful.
Thank you, John.
I'm really excited to have this conversation with you both. So I want to introduce you to our audience. And let me start, Sherri. Now I got this wrong. I learned in our conversation before we started. I always remembered you as the first environmentalist on the staff of the Senate Armed Services Committee, but you told me just now that you came as a nuclear weapons expert. So why don't you give us that evolution, please?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, John. It's a privilege to be here both with you and with Rudy. We have spent so much of our working years together in different capacities. So, I joined the Senate Armed Services Committee a few years after you did. And I was hired by Senator Nunn and Arnold Pinaro, the staff director, to oversee the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons complex and the nuclear weapons accounts. So the labs, Sandia, Los Alamos, Livermore, and at the time we were producing nuclear materials at places like Hanford and Savannah River and at Rocky Flats. And I recall going to visit Rocky Flats outside of Denver, where we processed plutonium in glove box operations. And they said to me, "Ma'am, are you of childbearing age?" And I was in my 20s at the time. And I said, "Well, I guess so." And they said, "Well, don't go in that building." So that's where they were processing with glove box operations plutonium. Well, shortly thereafter, the FBI conducted an oversight of that plant and found that it was criminally negligent in its operations. And that lacks set of safety practices, combined with the fact that at the end of the Cold War, we didn't need as much plutonium, sort of transformed the defense programs into a combination of smaller defense programs and an environmental management, environment safety program. Wow. But that happened while I was at the committee,
really
not the basis for which I was hired. We were also doing, you may recall, treaty ratification, the INF treaty, where I worked with our colleague Bob Bell, of blessed memory, on that treaty ratification.
But were you an environmentalist before you got into this experience with?
Not at all. I had already written a book on nuclear weapons. I wrote a book. My first book was on the neutron bomb controversy, case study in alliance politics that I had written actually as part of my undergraduate thesis. And then after college, I worked at SAIC, on defense programs during the Reagan administration, really, for which were being led. We were doing contract support for Richard Pearl and T.K. Jones with enough shovels. We were doing kind of basic nuclear weapons analysis. How many targets did you have to hold at risk in the Warsaw Pact, in the Soviet Union, to have assurance of your first strike capability? So those were all the classic nuclear weapons analysis skills.
This is so interesting because I honestly, in my memory of you at the Armed Services Committee, was as the first environmentalist. And I always wondered, because Senator Nunn was not a champion on environmental issues, but nobody was back then, and that you were one of the pioneers. And so we'll explore that in a minute. Let me just introduce Rudy, if I could. Rudy, you were the staff director for Les Aspin on the House Armed Services Committee, and then when Mr. Aspin became the Secretary of Defense, you became the Chief of Staff. And when you went over to DOD, you created this position. It wasn't necessarily the first, but you elevated it for environmental quality. Tell me why did that happen?
Well, one of the things you learn, John, and Sherri points out, is that policy is not always a straight line. It's in chapters, and there's a lot of zigging and zagging. So we had the acquisitions secretary, that was Dr. John Deutsch from MIT, but more and more, the nuclear weapons complex were really the first, but we were about to be into round 3 of the base closures. We did 5. And what we were learning was that environmental cleanup became a big issue of turning over the bases to the communities once you were closing them. It was not enough just simply to say, sorry, we're closing your base after 70 years, but help them find a reuse for some of those facilities. So we needed different skills, but more and more on that hardware side and on the operational side, climate was emerging more and more. There had been Hurricane Andrew, which really had a very devastating impact on the Air Force in Florida. And as I noted, we had the base closure rounds. We had 3 Mile Island. We had the troops coming home from Kuwait after being exposed to the oil field fires that burned continuously for 9 months. And so it was a different kind of issues that needed to be solved. How do we use policy and programs to to be better for the troops in terms of perfecting them in the field, but that also what you contaminate, you have to clean up. And so this became part of the acquisition domain. I think Professor Deutsch, who was a brilliant chemist and very, very much a scientist, suddenly found himself focusing as much on the cleanup at the labs and at some of these closed bases. So we need it was also a time for new thinkers and a new generation. The Democrats hadn't been on the executive branch, and there was not a better pool of trained people than in the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. Thus, a logical chance to bring someone like Sherri Goodman in and the other fellows that we would bring in from time to time. One of them I'm looking directly at.
Well, and I do want to move on to the book, but I want to just follow up on what Rudy just opened up, because you were trying to create new authorities and resources for cleanup. I remember that, and you got a lot of pushback from Congress at the time. You had a lot of battles when you first went to DOD. Sherri, can you just recall the experiences you were getting when you had to try to fight to get environmental cleanup money from the Congress at a time when people were not really attuned to that?
Right. Well, I came into Department of Defense with you and with Rudy at the beginning of the Clinton administration, where President Clinton and Vice President Gore in particular wanted to elevate attention to environmental security matters, as we called it. Now, the Department of Defense at that time already had scores of Superfund bases, and it already had funds directed to cleaning up military bases. But as Rudy said, this third round of base closure shone another spotlight on it, and for President Clinton, it was important to him that he could deliver to communities where bases were being closed, and many of them were being closed in California, right, which was important to his election. So in 1993, early 93, when he had to accept this round of base closures, he wanted to lean into remedies for the community. And so he called it job-centered property disposal with fast-track cleanup. Now, there was nothing inherently fast about the way cleanup is usually conducted because it requires multiple assessments and approvals and characterization and assessments. And so, we had to do a couple different things. We had to live up to the president's commitment that he had made on our behalf that we were going to fast-track cleanup for communities, and we had to manage Congress's expectations about how fast we could clean up closing bases, but also active bases, and not do so in a way that was going to bust the budget, right? And as you noted, John, the services in particular didn't really want to own the funding for it, which is why Senator Stevens, actually, who is the father, Senator Ted Stevens is the father of the Defense Environmental Restoration Program in DOD. And why did he create it? Because he didn't like barrels from 55-gallon drum barrels left over from World War II that were unsightly throughout parts of Alaska. And so he said, DOD, you're going to get rid of them. And so he put the funding in there. He created the Defense Environmental Restoration Program. He supported it. But then there came this tension between how fast are you going to go? So we were balancing all of that, trying to meet those commitments. We even provided some modest level of funding to EPA out of the defense budget so that they could hire the staff and work at the same pace as DOD, so they could do the reviews concurrently instead of sequentially. And so at the end, by the end of the administration, we had turned over 80% of that property for reuse. And enabled it to be
Gosh,
reused
you've
by
brought back
communities.
so many memories.
Yeah.
It's just become vivid again for my memory. Thank you. I was good. Let me turn to the book. It's called Threat Multiplier, and I think you invented that term. You organized a bunch of admirals and generals back maybe 15 years ago. To focus on environment. Tell us first, why don't you give us a summary of the book? Tell us what are you saying in this book?
Well, this book chronicles the military's environmental and climate journey, both as I've lived it, and we've talked about it since the earliest days on the Armed Services Committee at the end of the Cold War, where, as we say, we went from weapons to waste. In terms of understanding the impact of military activities on the environment, cleaning up both at the nuclear weapons complex and then later on in the Department of Defense. The first part of the book really chronicles how we've gotten to the place we are today, but it's really more about the military's impact on the environment. As you said, we've just talked about cleaning up at bases, but then there's also the natural resources. That's been an important part too. The military is the nation's second largest landholder and has important ecosystems and endangered species. And training ranges actually had been shut down during the 1990s at Fort Bragg, now Fort Liberty, for a failure to protect the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker, which makes its home in the longleaf pine tree, which once covered most of the Southeast and is now found mostly on military bases from North Carolina to Florida. So how is the military going to square this circle? How can it both protect this endangered bird and have realistic training? Well, the Marines and the Army figured out they didn't actually need to cut down the tree. They could actually convert it into a realistic training obstacle. And therefore, it could protect the nest of the tree and the bird, the nest for the bird, and also enhance training and readiness. So that's a theme that occurs throughout the book of really figuring out how impacts on the environment can actually be used to enhance and improve readiness. The other third theme of this first chapter of environmental security is about working with allies and partners. At the end of the Cold War, we were trying to remove a lot of nuclear weapons from Russia and the former Soviet states. And we were also trying to reinvigorate our alliances around the world. So we also had a series of military-to-military environmental cooperation with countries around the world. And particularly in that era, I was leading for Secretary Perry, our boss, something called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation, where we helped remove liquid waste streams from decommissioned and sunken Russian nuclear submarines so that they would not contaminate Norwegian fishing grounds. So that was an example of many other types of military-to-military environmental cooperation. As you said, about 15 now, almost 20 years ago, I organized the first group of generals and admirals when I was at CNA to assess the national security implications of climate change. People like General Sullivan, who had been Chief of Staff of the United States Army, and Skip Bowman, who had been head of the Navy nuclear program, and Admiral Preer, head of Pacific Command, and General Zinni, head of CENTCOM, and others. And we spent a year with the nation's leading climate scientists and intelligence and national security professionals in the U.S. and the U.K. to understand what are the national security implications of climate change. How would rising sea levels and hotter temperatures and increased storms and floods and fires affect our security? So how does the environment affect our security, as opposed to the environment impacts, which was in the first chapter, first era. So at the end of this year of assessment, we realized that there would be a direct implication that climate change would act, as we call it, as a threat multiplier for instability in volatile regions of the world, and that it would affect us even in stable regions. And that's really launched 2 decades of work now on climate and security that enables us to better understand how climate is going to act as a destabilizing factor wherever we're operating in the world today.
So let's dig into this, because I think you've both described two different phenomena. One is the Defense Department realizing it had dirtied the environment, and it had both obligations, moral obligations, as well as just practical obligations to clean it up. And then the question of whether there's a larger consciousness about the environment as a national security issue. I mean, and this has been an evolving thing. Rudy, you've been involved in these discussions. How do you see that evolution?
Well, I think it ultimately, if you want to get something done in the Pentagon, it has to be a readiness issue. You have the hardware side and you have the operational side. And so, one of the big impacts were the soldiers and Marines, those who had been on the ground in Kuwait in the '91 Desert Storm under President Bush, were coming back sick. And there was not a clear diagnosis. Ross Perot spent a lot of money, but it was clear that learning how to clean an environment or operate in a very dirty environment that was dangerous was having an impact on troops' health. Equally important, the water system at Pearl Harbor or Camp Lejeune, became contaminated. So these were all part of readiness issues. So there was definitely a good public policy element of it, but you were driven by necessity. As well as anyone, everyone in the defense budget wants a bigger piece of the pie, but you really have to bring it down to one of the key discriminators. How will this improve readiness and make the troops more effective? And so the health of the troops became an issue, both with their families at the home base, but I think coming back from the '91 Gulf War was both in terms of the health impact and then also the technology. That was the first time that GPS had ever been used in a deployment. And we learned that it was not just simply the plane or the tank or the ship, but it was rather the ability to navigate off of a little box that was connected to a satellite. So all of these things were starting to change what had been our traditional concepts of readiness into a much more dynamic environment. It was a bipolar world during the Cold War. You had bases in Central Europe, and you took care of their families, and you had bases in Japan. But now we were moving away from sort of being forward deployed to expeditionary, where we were moving into very challenging environment and places. And so we needed a different sense of how we took care of the health of the force, and then the additional technology pieces that they needed.
Sherri, obviously these last 4 years have been the administration has really embraced what you've said about environment being a national security threat. We now have a Trump administration coming back, and they don't give the same priority. How do you feel the military is going to react? Do you think there's residual consciousness that's going to sustain these things, or do you think that we're just going to fall back into a tactical environment going forward?
Well, I think it's really all about managing risks. That's how the military assesses for readiness purpose, for operational purposes, what are the risks and threats it's got to confront. So in the Cold War, when we assessed that a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack could be catastrophic, and it was a very low probability but very high consequence event, we invested billions of Americans' GDP to defend and deter against that threat, and we were successful. Now, in the climate era, we have a set of risks that are arguably higher probability. They're occurring now almost every day in every way, with reasonably high consequences, especially to readiness of our troops when they have to deploy in hotter temperatures, because it's hotter in most of the equatorial regions now, which is producing many more instances of heat stroke and heat stress. We have more black flag days where troops can't safely train at many of our own bases in the South and Southwest. And then we have impacts to our infrastructure. So it's about readiness and being able to manage the risks of climate and then be resilient in the face of those risks. So I think the focus on resilience of our troops, resilience of our infrastructure, and then also resilience of the way we operate our weapon systems in the face of changing, let's say, salinity and acoustics for submarines and ships in warmer temperatures, or hotter air where it's harder, where you need, it's harder for aircraft to take off. So managing against those changing Earth system, natural system dynamics is a core readiness and operational issue. So I think that has become embedded into how the department is assessing risk today. And it's my expectation that much of that in protecting the force as a mission assurance matter will continue.
But, I think one of the things I hear, at least from my friends, is that President Trump, when he is after the inauguration, is going to pull us out of the Paris Climate Accords again. So I'm wondering, how do we see, because DOD on its own can't do too much about these factors. Isn't there a larger reality here that's a problem?
Yeah, well, yes, that is a geostrategic issue for, that's much broader than just the military, right? So the military has to be able to operate in the face of climate risks. The military was never, it's on its own, going to solve the world's or even the nation's climate challenge. And so, the U.S. has gone some way in reducing its emissions. It might change that path, in the next 4 years. What we do on emissions is not, globally, will probably not even fully be determined by what happens at the climate conferences, because we've seen, even since the Paris Agreement, if you say that was the high water mark in 2015, that the commitments have tapered, and the focus has been more, in many ways, on how do we get to and there's many different views on this, but into the energy transition, which is already underway. It's not that we're not using we're still using lots of different fossil fuels.
Gosh, I guess,
of all types, right? But now there's been one area of great consensus, John, as you well know, that we've worked on together in the last few years, has been about the need for more nuclear energy as a carbon-free source, right? And even at the climate conference, the parties have agreed that we need to triple our deployments of nuclear energy by 2050 if we're going to be serious about meeting climate goals. And we're still probably not going to meet the ones that are on the table now, but we can accelerate our investments and our deployments in nuclear energy and other lower carbon technologies.
Gosh, I think it's just astounding. I think every week I read about some new project that's being launched on nuclear here in this country. It's it was just moribund for 30 years, and now it's just exploding.
Right, because now we're designing new advanced nuclear reactors that are safe by design. And I think so we've entered a new generation of nuclear technology, and we know we need it as a carbon-free source.
Yeah.
And so I think it's an exciting time. There are many ways in which, let's say, the military, which is not going to be the major deployer of these new nuclear plants, but there are some places where the military can deploy as a first mover in remote locations and use its buying power to help test out and advance some of the permitting processes that we need as a way to showcase we can get there.
Let me just ask you both to reflect on. It just feels like we're in a pivotal moment here. I mean, for 30 years, or 70 years, we had a U.S.-led international regime that was working, certainly worked for us. A lot of people didn't think it worked for them. We now seem that we've got supply chains that are changing pretty profoundly, unclear how much of a decoupling there's going to be, but it does feel like this is starting pretty significantly to see barriers emerging. It feels to me like this is a pivotal moment, and is environmental consciousness and commitment to non-carbon fuels going to be the focal point in this new era? I think the war in Ukraine made energy security such a prominent goal, and everything is shifting now. So, Rudy, your thoughts here to begin, and then Sherri.
I'm back to my opening thought. In Washington, it's never a straight line, and it's about chapters. And the chapters are different. But, I think some of the change, will be part of the political debate, but other realities are staring us straight in the face. The notion that we can have a fleet of tankers following our ground troops is probably an operational concept that's not, so you're going to have to figure out what are the next generation of systems. Very prominent in the 2000s was something called globalization. There was a famous GE CEO who said outsource as much to Asia. That's changing. But when we buy a car, it no longer says it's made in America or made in Europe. It says it's assembled in Kansas City or it's assembled in South Carolina with a global supply chain moving in. You had a good program here at the CSIS with David Sanger on his book, where he was talking about the CHIPS program and becoming more technologies that we invented end up being outsourced and manufactured overseas. So it's going to be a combination of things, and so there'll be certainly a political debate, but necessity and competition will force us, both in the national security domain, but also economically, to remain competitive in terms of the supply chains, and also on the readiness of our force in terms of where they're going to be going into the future. Maybe Desert Storm was the last big desert tank-on-tank war. Maybe it will be a different set of systems.
We've got electric drones that are changing the war in Ukraine.
Or unmanned vehicles. But the notion that you're going to have a fleet of tankers in your forward movements is probably something we will not see in the next chapter. So back to, there are a lot of different chapters, and one of the other thing I've learned about American politics are that the contradictions are plenty. You're for one thing but against the other, but take people to the Roosevelt Memorial, and over here it says, I hate war. And in the next panel, it says, America must be the arsenal of democracy. And sort of a contradiction there, but back to this chapters. And so I think the politics will change, but that we'll see some changes. And, it will be interesting to see how some of the new policy initiatives from the new administration work on Wall Street and in terms of the investment community that really have to invest in the next generation systems.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up, this. I think they calculated that a gallon of gasoline in Iraq was costing $100 a gallon or something. Or might be
Closer to
more.
$400 a gallon. The
$400
fully
a gallon.
burdened cost of fuel, as determined by the Defense Science Board in a study led by Jim Schlesinger, was $400
$400 a gallon because of all of the structure it took to get that gallon of fuel forward. And so then the question is, what do we do? I mean, but it seems to me this war in Ukraine is changing the whole dynamic. I mean, it's certainly, this is an electric war, first time in history. I think this is profoundly different. Missiles will always be chemical, but this is a profoundly different war. So, Sherri, do you think the foundations are there now, technically, for reconfiguring the Defense Department the way it uses energy?
Well, I think we're moving in that direction because we've always depended on our technological edge to be competitive, right? So, for so many years, we assumed, that energy energy would just be available on the battlefield. Yeah. And then General Mattis, when he was in Iraq, in Afghanistan, back almost 15 years ago now, or 20 years ago actually, called on us to be unleashed from the tether of fuel. And as Rudy has said and observed, we had the long supply lines and the convoys in those two wars where we were losing Marines and soldiers trucking fuel to the front to improvised explosive device attacks. And most of those convoys were for fuel and water. So just for the safety of our force and the protection of our troops, we've innovated already for a generation about how to reduce those supply chains, and supply lines in contested logistics environment. Now, the Ukraine war is again another technological leap. So now it will be so how are we going to get that electricity?
Yeah, how do we get electricity?
And well, because there's a whole innovation going on today in batteries too. And the military is part of it. They're not the only ones, but the Defense Department is also investing in better batteries, long duration storage batteries for everything from remote locations to the microgrids that we're deploying on military bases here at home as a way to be untethered from the larger electric grid, which is unreliable. So, because our bases have to operate 24/7, even in the face of a storm or a cyber attack or another deliberate attack, right? So when you have that we have that requirement today. So the Black Start exercises that require you to operate for 14 days without power from the grid have led to an investment in microgrids where you can use everything from better batteries to you could use in the future a small modular reactor.
Yeah.
To you could use your fossil fuel, but you can be untethered, and it leads to distributed energy resources, so you can be creative.
Now, we made a decision, I think 56 years ago, I think it was, to get rid of our power plants in our military facilities. We used to have our own
Yep.
coal-fired
Right.
generating
Right.
plants making electricity down in Norfolk. And we shut them all down. We said, this is too expensive, we're going to go on
Right.
the grid. And maybe it's good economics, but it's also bad security. I mean, how quickly do you think we could get true independence for our crucial national security facilities from being dependent on the current grid today? Is that in our horizon in near term?
Well, it is a goal, I think, and I think it will. I don't think we will be completely disconnected from energy sources outside the fence line, because much of these microgrid installations are happening in conjunction with local utilities and local power operators. But it's designed to be more distributed and off the main grid so that you can have more reliable power. So I think we are on our way there. And I hope that will continue, because that's not really
Yeah.
about exactly what source of energy you use. It's about being more energy reliable and energy resilient in any given location, having a microgrid that's separate from the main grid.
I personally, I wish the department would invest in SMRs, for crucial national security facilities. We've got to have base load 24 hours a day, completely reliable energy, electricity, and I think we should be doing it. But it looks like the nuclear renaissance is going to take place in the private sector, so we got to figure out how we catch up.
I think it's going to be, I'm hopeful, John, that it will be both.
I do too.
I think that there are areas of bipartisan energy action coming forward in this, in the new year, in the new administration with the new Congress, and I think nuclear is likely to be one of them. So I think, and when we look at also the areas of resilience, that's been very bipartisan on the defense bill in the last decade. A lot of efforts to sort of improve the resilience of our military bases and also assess the risk to our troops from
So do you think is that a meeting ground between the two parties next Congress?
I think it is. I think just two illustrations. On 9/11, Day 1 and Day 2 really belong to the New York Police Department and the New York Fire Department in terms of their heroism and their moving forward in the face of just tremendous danger. By Day 3 and 4, the U.S. Army was at the lower end of Manhattan reconstructing the communications for Wall Street, the financial center of America. One of the financial centers of the world had to reopen. And in fact, on their backs of the Army Signal Corps and the Corps of Engineers, they were able to improvise and keep everything up and running. So I think, we're dealing with that, but I think you ask a very key question, if the network at the household goes off or you can't recharge the phone, the neighborhood's in a panic because they're so dependent now. We've made that change. But again, it's the advancement. We can't slow some of these things down. I remember the comptroller who by necessity had to supervise sort of the reconstruction of the Pentagon. This was in the 1990s, and I forget the technical name we had. But one of the things that you did in your management and oversight of that was to change the whole building from analog to digital. And I think that's an amazing accomplishment. You led the other institutions of the country, and so now this is a digital country.
Yeah.
And so the next piece will be the energy systems and then the security of our networks going forward, which you here at the center, you've been championing some of those issues. So once you start down a path, you may zigzag, and some chapters will be fast and other chapters will be slower. And we probably will be depending more and more on the private sector for some of these things. But we can't uninvent the digital world as much as we liked the old days. And
But also connected with that, and also happening under your watch, John, at the Pentagon, during the Pentagon renovation, was not only the digital innovations that occurred in that renovation, but were the energy efficiency.
That's true, too.
Okay, and that was a very important chapter for the Pentagon as the world's largest office building. We brought in Amory Lovins, who was a renowned, founder of the Rocky Mountain Institute and knew everything about energy efficiency. And he did a whole energy efficiency plan for the Pentagon, so that as part of the renovation, it could reduce its electricity burden and also put in some alternative energy sources as part of that renovation even some years ago.
We were never honest about what it cost to do the renovation. That was not, I think the formal number was, I think it's over $50 million. It was probably closer to $3 billion, but it did make a big difference. We had our own power generating plant.
Exactly.
And so let me, I'm intrigued on what are the opportunities bipartisanship on this agenda going forward. And I say this not as a partisan comment, I'm just making a factual observation that the Republican Party in Washington tends to be skeptical of climate change, but at the local level, people, they hear their own voters, and so they tend to be much more sympathetic at the local level. Do you see an opportunity here on how we could sustain more of this agenda, Sherri, and this going forward?
Well, let's take one good example. Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida was heavily damaged in Hurricane Michael in 2018.
Boy, was it ever, yeah.
Right? And the roofs were ripped off the hangars at the F-35, and the Florida congressional delegation was right out of the box calling for that base to be rebuilt and to be rebuilt in a way that resilient to stronger storms. Now, maybe they didn't call it climate, they called it stronger storms, extreme weather events, but nonetheless, it's allowing that particular base to be a model of future resiliency. And there are other bases around the country, many of them in red districts, that are having that same sort of resilience. We could call it a resilience renaissance, if you will, where you're meeting the increased extreme weather events or flooding or fires that we face all around the country now, particularly in the West. We're even having them in California today, so that you can continue to operate. So I think that is an opportunity.
At the local level.
At the local level,
yeah.
but military bases around the country need that, so it has to happen, wherever we operate.
So is Elon Musk going to hear this argument as we redesign the government? Rudy, you live more in that world. What do you think's coming that way?
Well, I think the largest builder of electric cars that Americans are buying right now, has a foot in all of these camps. We can always learn from outsiders. There are better ways to do things. The Pentagon and the Capitol actually have their own power systems, but we don't turn them on because the local communities are now used to, the revenues from servicing the Pentagon or servicing the U.S. Capitol. But in an emergency, either, we have a backup. Not every town and state has backups like that. And so there are certain things you have to do because you think they're good policy, but what drives a lot of decisions is necessity. And so not enough water or too much water at home base, let alone around the world, and operating in those places become critical skills. So I think, when the city moves away from politics being the first paragraph of the discussion to how do we solve this, because, in northern North Carolina had a huge flood, dependent on both the Guard and the active duty to come and help them out. And so that's not politics, that's a necessity of helping our fellow Americans. So we're going to sort of see a political debate that sometimes is out of sync with what the necessities are. And when the political debate is exhausted, we usually do the right thing. And I think that's what we want to do. There's been real progress made on our sufficiency in the tech world and bringing some of that home. And then, for all of the discussion on oil versus electric, our cars today get a lot better gas mileage than they did in the 1980s and 1990s. So pushing in that direction is important. But, the political symbols, you dial in. It used to be we'd all read the Washington Post every morning and we'd find the respected, Walter Lippmans of the world. Now we sort of dial into what we deem our self-interested point of view to be, and so we don't really cross-exchange anymore. But I think once you start making progress, it's very difficult to reverse it. It may be slower, but I think it's necessity that is pushing us to be more self-reliant,
especially if
cleaner.
it's ground up.
Well, and some of the necessity is that, for example, our military and National Guard is called up so much more frequently today to respond to floods, fires, and extreme weather events. Just in these last Hurricane Milton and Hurricane Helene in Florida and North Carolina, we had 12,000 troops called up to help with the response. And we expect our forces to be there for the American people. And this is also happening around the world, from fires in Greece to floods in Spain. So everywhere around the world, and in Taiwan and the Philippines recently with recent storms, so everywhere around the world, the demand signal for military forces to back up emergency first responders is increasing. So we have to prepare our force to be able to do that, and also learn the lessons from that. How do we ensure that our force can continue to operate and improve? One of the technology areas, John, that I think is exciting, not only the energy technologies that are coming along, but the predictive capability for understanding climate. So that we can have responsible and reliable climate intelligence for decision making at shorter time frames. We have always depended on the weather, right, for a military operation. Think of D-Day, that General Eisenhower moved the actual date of that D-Day landing because of the weather forecast, so that he could be sure he'd have, the right weather conditions for that massive victory invasion. So now weather is reliable out for a day, but climate predictions are longer term, and they don't necessarily give you what you need to make a decision within the next year or 2 years about where you might need to deploy or how to protect your force, or where the ice is going to be retreating in the Arctic and what kind of opening we're going to see there. But that is coming with both improved technologies and improved science prediction and skill. And so that's also now an exciting frontier.
Just to your point, yesterday I was talking with a young guy that's got a company that has a little sensor about the size of your hand. It's charged by solar cells. It smells the environment in a forest. They just drop them from helicopters or drones, and it detects forest fires instantly.
Right.
Remarkable. I mean, so they're incredible things.
One of the most areas of greatest need now is improved fire prediction, so that because we have firefighters who are on the line there, and they're at risk themselves from as they go to combat those fires.
But I asked him, what's the revenue model to sustain this thing? And we're still working on that, and this is always the problem with new technology. But I do think it's a remarkable time that we're living in. You guys won't remember this, but when I came to Washington, you drove south on Route 1 from the airport going into Alexandria. There was a giant coal-fired power plant right there, and there were big, huge mountains of coal. This was at the time I've been in Washington. We've gotten rid of all that, So there has been real progress. We're coming down on a few minutes left. Sherri, look out into the future. I mean, you've been doing that. You're talking about environment as a threat multiplier. But tell us what gives you hope as you look into the future.
Well, what gives me hope is that we have been able, as we've seen throughout our lifetime, to harness the technologies we've needed with the talent of the American people to combat some of our greatest threats. I started my career, as I know you did, John, in the Cold War, when we were laser focused on the nuclear threat or an attack by the Soviet Union on our forces, in Europe, and bringing in, and so now we've seen that whole set of threats. They're still there in very real ways, but we've been able to advance our technologies and our talent to sort of change and shift that threat vector to other ones we face today. And we've made progress in many areas. I think we've made a lot of environmental and climate progress in the last few decades, but we've also made life better for so many. Now, there's a lot more to do, so we can't rest on our laurels, but I do, believe, myself being the daughter of Holocaust refugees, so grateful to have been able to live a life in America, that we have to keep our own country strong, and that we need to recognize all of those important values as we continue forward.
Rudy, what gives you hope?
Well, I think if we tune out some of the political discord going on right now, we know how, when there's a crisis, to work together. Back to the Armed Services Committees of the House and Senate, working with the Reagan White House on so many issues, from arms control to military readiness to oversight of the defense budget, all of these pieces. So we know how to do that, but we've sort of been in a cultural drift with all of the new technology. Again, we don't share a common baseline anymore. It's instead, we go to the network that's going to give us, what we want to hear, a kind of a thing. And so to a certain degree, we need to tune that out, but and it's not clear that we're going to have any substantive successes right off the bat. But necessity will drive some things. And necessity will drive people from being very political, I won't budge, to needing to be pragmatic, because our fellow countrymen need that to solve problems. If you're in the West and don't have water, it's a disaster. If you're in high altitudes and have fires, it's a disaster. If you're in the lowland, if you're in Florida or North Carolina and have a hurricane, these are devastating. And so we need to keep that common bound where we've been so practical in solving problems in the past. But that's amazing what happens when your chief military threat, which was the U.S.-Soviet Union competition for, our early lives, goes away, and it becomes much more complicated. And so figuring out how to navigate together, I think. But that's why I'll run this for you. That's why you're one of the few bipartisan discussing places in Washington these days. You're like the Chatham House in London.
Yeah.
And so that part, bringing people together who have different political perspectives but have to solve a problem, is sort of the lost art of which, you're one of the CSIS is one of the few standing places where that actually occurs in ways that the Armed Services Committees and a Republican executive branch, in the 80s, learned how to master that.
Yes,
Well,
and you've been a master of that, John, and I thank you, and I've learned so much from you along the way.
Well, my gosh, you're both very kind. I mean, I must tell you what has been hard for me is to realize that the conventional wisdom that I've just taken to be true is now being shown to not resonate with the American people. And can we revalidate the ideas that helped shape the last 70 years? Or are we really moving fundamentally into a new era that is just completely different from my life experience? I as both of you, devoted my life to, protecting and advancing the values of rule of law, freedom, liberty, open press. I mean, these were the cherished, and they just resonate in my heart. Are we in a new era now, or do we have to just rediscover those things and find new ways to talk to the American public about it? I actually think the environmental successes of the last 30 years is breathtaking. 30 years ago, there was so little consciousness. As you said, we were cleaning up polluted military sites. And now there's this a broad understanding and acceptance that we're on this planet and we're damaging it. And we got to do something. So, Sherri, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I want to thank you, John, and you, Rudy, both of you very much for having this conversation today. I do think that threat multiplier and the framing of understanding climate as a security issue and as a readiness issue for our forces and our troops and resilience can be a common ground as we move forward into a new era. And I'm hopeful and about our military being able to continue to lead, be ready to operate under all of these changing conditions that we see around the world, because they are going to change even outside our borders. So we have to be mindful and stay abreast of them.
I've so enjoyed this conversation with you both. Thank you. Folks, it's a remarkable book, Threat Multiplier. It's history and its perspective and its hopeful forecasting. And I think everybody ought to get it and read it. And thank you, Sherri. Thank you, Rudy.
John.
Thanks for joining us
John.
today. Good luck. I hope you sell 1 million.
With your endorsement, I'm sure I will.
Okay. Thank you both.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everybody.
much, John.